Hello, and welcome. Good morning. Apparently there's some AV issues, but you guys see this, and I got everything set up here, so I'm just going to start so we can keep to time. I'm going to talk about building APIs and backend services using PowerShell, and we'll see how it goes. I was up until at like 1 in the morning trying to get everything to work, so we'll see. Thanks to our sponsors. It's thanks to them that we have a great event here, and I hope you're all happy with it. I am, even though I haven't been paying attention since I've been doing my demos in my hotel room. My name is Robert. I'm a principal cloud engineer at Amesto 42. Yes, it's 42 like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is why we have t-shirts like this. So we basically all just do references to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy internally. We create services around platform engineering, security, and cloud native, and so on and so forth. I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Azure category. I'm a CNCF ambassador for the things that I do with the CNCF. So I'm in the tag app delivery, co-chair of the platforms working group, one of the maintainers on the OpenGateOS project, and I do a whole lot of other things. I'm also a HashiCorp ambassador for the things that I do with Terraform, which we're not going to talk about today. So. And I might have not updated the slide deck, we'll see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about PowerShell beyond scripts, how we can run it as services, running PowerShell cloud natively. And I had some demos. The serverless with Azure Functions, I thought that there was no reason to include, as Ben, who's going to be on stage here after me, is going to run you through how to do this. So, why get a repeat on that? I'm going to show off how to do web servers with PowerShell, and there's a typo there, apparently. I wanted to do it in a certain way. I'm going to get to that, but we just have to do it manually. And then recurring tasks with Kubernetes. So basically like a drop-in replacement for running as a service on a server or something like that. And I wanted to create a Kubernetes operator, but time. So I was doing stuff in my hotel room yesterday, and every time I did something that made a container image and put it up and then tried to pull it down again, it took like 10 minutes. So every time I did a change, it took like 10 minutes. So, bear with me. All right, PowerShell beyond scripts. So what can you do with PowerShell that is not just running scripts on your computer? Well, you can run it in a pipeline, which I think is a pretty standard way of doing stuff these days. You can run it on triggers based on you get the workflow. You can run it on, time with the triggers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a fine way of doing PowerShell. And you can also, for instance, use this in an API context or backend service context by creating some sort of like gateway that triggers these pipelines. So you can still use that as part of a backend service. You have software that runs scripts. There are numerous ones. I choose to include ScriptRunner because they are actually sponsoring this event. So thank you. And they have everything you need to run basically stuff as a service. So you can define your scripts, define your packages, click run, or have that triggered in different ways. And then there's cloud native solutions. So you have serverless and cloud functions, whatever you want to call it. So your Azure Functions, your Amazon AWS Lambdas, and so on and so forth. Or basically anything that runs a container, which can be a lot of things. It could be for instance, like Azure has its container service, and App Service also supports containers. Or you can run it in Kubernetes, which is what I'm gonna do. So yeah, like I said, Azure Functions, Container App Service, and Azure Kubernetes Service. Those are the main things. So, like I said, I cut out some stuff of this presentation, so we'll see how we are at the time at the end. Mainly the reason why I did that is because this conference has a lot of API talks. Some of these were yesterday. So if people are watching this video, that might be something you want to go back and look at, or if you missed it yesterday. I think besides this one, you have the building APIs with PowerShell and Azure Functions, which is going to be here. So I think this is like the API room today. Every API talk is happening here. And Ben is going to go through that with you, and that's a follow-along. So that's a great way of like getting up to speed with how to do Azure Functions. And then there's various other talks about consuming or setting up and creating your various sorts of APIs. All right. So mainly what I'm going to focus on today is a Kubernetes demo. The reason for that is basically our platform that we're creating. This is not a sales pitch, this is just me informing what we're doing. So what we're doing, we're creating a deployment platform. It's going to be run on Kubernetes. But we have a lot of infrastructure, sysadmin people that are used to creating stuff and running it in pipelines. And it gets kind of daunting, like how to teaching people how to program, for instance, is not something that we want to do. We want them to focus on what they do best. So the platform that we're building is focusing on automating Terraform, or basically anything that we can run in a container. So, for instance, if someone has done some scripts for a customer that they think this could be a service, they should just be able to put it into a container, put it into a platform, and then I'll expose it through APIs so that you can trigger it. Some of the techniques we're going to look at today. Speaking of which, there you go. So these last two pictures, by the way, if you see there's a delay between speakers, and when this picture comes out, it's because it's huge. I have no clue why it's like that, but it's been like that for a couple of years. All right. Anywho, so the first thing that I went and did, well, that didn't work. Oh, yes, obviously. I need to screen mirror or not. Separate display. There we go. Text big enough for everyone? Holding in the back? Everyone cool? Great. Thumbs up. So the first thing you need to run stuff in Kubernetes is obviously some sort of container. We could do this inline. I'm going to show that afterwards. But for sake of simplicity, I've created a container that's just based on the official Microsoft container image for PowerShell. This one in particular is using Alpine Linux, just because it's small and it kind of is the default. I wanted, but just for clarity also, I wanted to use ChainGuard images. If you haven't heard about that, they're creating, ChainGuard is a security, cloud-native security company. They make really small container images that have basically no CVs. So the idea is that it's updated all the time. So if there is any CVs, they're going to get eradicated straight away. So, really secure. Problem is, obviously, it's really secure. So when I'm doing demos of stuff that might need some rights that you shouldn't necessarily have in a container, everything went to hell. So I just went like, okay, sure. Let's just take the slightly bigger, slightly less secure. It's not that it's not secure. It's actually pretty fine. So basically, we're using our PowerShell image as a base image, and then we're copying over the bunch of scripts that I have created. And I'm also installing a module called Pod, however you're supposed to pronounce that. So I went searching for how, creating web servers with PowerShell. And you could just build it, because obviously you can run .NET stuff. So there's, you could just do that straight off. But the thing about web servers is they have a lot of things in it. You need to deal with endpoints of different kind of middleware, et cetera, logging. So I was just looking, and I found this Pod. We're just going to show it off. And Pod is basically, like I said, a cross-platform framework to create web service. That's on PowerShell. So if you're looking to do that sort of thing, look into it. I can't endorse it because I've used it for 2 days or something. But it basically supports a whole lot of stuff. The main drawback by using something like this, just like in my experience, is that this is one person. Relying on something that's based on one person's work might be a little bit risky if that one person just disappears. So if I wish there was like a big project with a lot of different companies behind it, but this is what we have. And that Turns out that doesn't run in Kubernetes that easily. And like I said, everything took like 10 minutes to check. So we're going to run it manual on my computer. So this is, oh, sorry, bigger font. There you go. So this is basically how you do pod. Very easy. You create, you run the start pod server, and then you can just add endpoints. You can add routes. You can even add full-on web pages, apparently, and just put in whatever you want. If I do this, hope everything works. I think I'm running now. I don't know why my terminal didn't pop up, but let's check it out. Localhost 8080. There you go. Now we have an API. So, oh, sorry, it's really small. There you go. So this is as simple as it gets, right? So if you wanted to do this yourself, you would have to use the .NET web server DLL thingamajig, get it in, and tweak it to your liking, and so on and so forth. What I had to do is this, right? So obviously, using this kind of framework makes it a little bit easier. On the webpage, they have, if you wanted to run this as an Azure function, they have guides for that. If you wanted to run and create your Docker container, you can do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's various ways of running this. They integrate into IIS, et cetera. So they've done, this person has done a lot of work behind this, and I think it worked. So, just didn't work in my environment, but that's basically my fault. Anywho, so that's how we can run a web server. So what, we can look at how the deployment would have worked in Kubernetes if it worked. So as you can see, I used ChatGPT, or the Copilot, sorry, to write this, and I didn't get anything particular good, so I had to write it myself anyway. But who here is familiar with Kubernetes? All right. Ish, like 40% of the room. So just for everyone else, in Kubernetes, when I refer to pod, that is one or a collection of containers. So it's like a container group in other scenarios. When I could create a static pod, which I just define and put it out. But what we usually do is create something called a deployment. That's a abstraction layer that takes care of your entire deployment. So that puts out all the pods. And that's when we can get stuff like replicas. So we can say we want 10 replicas, and it will create 10 pods. And it kind of just do the life cycle work for us. So this is a deployment file. I just give it a name, how many replicas. The selector is basically something for the deployment to know what container or a pod is part of the deployment. I create a template on how it's supposed to look. It has a label. And then I define the one container that I have right now, and it could be several containers in different scenarios, but usually you just kind of end up with one pod with one container. This one is called web server. It has an image. It's the container that I'm building on GitHub. I have image pull policy set to always because I was doing the checks and stuff. You probably want it to be set to if not present. So you pull it down once. And right now I'm also, as you can see by tag, I'm just building it manually. But usually you would have it set to a specific tag, right? So if not present would then work, because then you could just update the tag and it would actually pull down the image. And then in the container, I'm running the command PowerShell with the file web server. And I give it some resource limits and requests just because it's good practice to do, and expose the container port. The unfortunate part is I run this and I try to do something called a port forwarding, which is just setting up basically a tunnel to the deployment, and nothing happens. And again, troubleshooting this at 1 o'clock in the morning right before I'm going to do a presentation kind of didn't work. So we just had to look at it manually. I will say that I'm going to try to get this to work in a proper fashion, and I'm going to put out on Twitter and everything else that this was a solution to this, and all the code will be in the PSConfEU repositories for for this year. So if you are interested. Anyway, let's go to something that works. So I wanted to do a practical example of using, getting some information, storing it, and then reusing it. So I created a script for getting weather information, because that's an easy demo to do. So basically what we're doing here is we're checking the weather from Open Weather Map for Prague. And I'm referencing an environment variable here for my API key. I created that as a secret in the backend. I'm going to delete it afterwards. I probably could just show it, but don't store secrets in Git, etc. And I'm using invoke REST method to just do a get call on this particular URL. And then what I'm doing, I'm putting this out into a file based on and calling it weather dash, and then I'm using this long string to just generate the time of day to have unique files. And storing that, and then I'll use this in what's called a cron job. Cron job, if you're familiar with computer terms, might make sense, but basically it's a job in Kubernetes. A job is a single run thing. You run it once, and when it's done, it quits. A cron job does that on a timer. So by setting it to just stars, I'm running this job every minute. And what it does is put up a pod that has a volume. So this is a persistent volume claim. I said I want a volume, and I want it to be persistent. The container is the same container because I have all my scripts on it. But this time I'm running PowerShell file weather with a dash fetch switch that I put in. And this is the volume mount that mounts this volume to the /data environment. And then I set up my environment variables by defining it as Open Weather API key. And I'm using a secret in Kubernetes. So this is the name of the secret, and this is the key of the secret in the value inside of the secret. This is how we define a persistent volume. So I'm just saying this is the access type is read write once. Storage class standard, that's the only thing I have because I haven't added anything else. It's supposed to be 1 gig, and host path is something relevant to the node itself. And then we have the claim. So the claim that the pods can then use to claim storage space on this, and as I said, 100 megabytes is what it gets, which should be fine. So let's see if this works. So sorry that this is black. Hyperterminal didn't want to just easily jump over to something else. So I'm just running a kubectl apply on that file, and it's going to take a little bit of time to start doing stuff. But if I check, I have my cron job. And by the way, on top, I have K9s, or K9s, which is a terminal GUI, which sounds weird, to basically just handle Kubernetes stuff. So instead of having to write kubectl, get cron jobs, namespace, all those things, I can just go in and select the things. So it says that everything is okay, and it has run and it's completed. If I press L, I can see the logs. And as you can see, apparently it's 296 degrees, which I thought was funny. So by the way, how are you feeling? Is it hot? How are you dealing with this heat? Rob graciously came by before the thing and went like, is that Kelvin? And then they checked, and yes, it's Kelvin. So apparently if you go to Open Weather Map API and ask for the temperature, you get it into Kelvin, which I guess is a compromise between Celsius and Fahrenheit. So you have to convert it yourself. I don't know. I didn't even think about that. So I was just looking at it and go like, oh, this is almost 300 degrees. Okay. Anyway, if you go back now, we see there's another job that's run. So it will do this every minute. And it basically just runs, get the data. Whatever it logs there is what it's putting into different JSON files, and this is all stored in the backend. Now, we want to check that data as well. So I created a job called PSConfEU Weather Demo Presenter for some reason, which again basically just do the exact same thing, but instead of doing this every minute, it just does it once, and it runs the file without the .fetch. And if we look at the weather.ps1 file, the default, if you don't have the fetch switch, is to just sort out all the JSON files, looks into what is the newest one, get the content, and convert it from JSON so it's something that's representable. But if this was something that would pull it out and give this to a user through an API, then you obviously would just have the JSON content. But it makes it look more pretty for us. So if I do a k apply weather, and the reason why I write k is because I have an alias, if you were wondering about that. And as soon as I press the enter button, it should create a pod. So it's already creating a pod. And this is, I keep on scrolling there, but this is the latest data that it got. Probably should have had something that actually wrote out the name of the file just to prove that this is what's happening. I checked it manually, don't worry, I think. You can see the pressure at least has risen, so good for us. So that is how you could just create a script, put it into a container, run it, get some sort of result, store it somewhere. At this point, like I'm storing this in a let's see, what am I at the time? All right, cool. Right now I'm storing this as a on Kubernetes, but obviously you could pull data in and you could put it somewhere else if you have a SQL database, if you have, wherever you're storing your stuff in, so other people can fetch the data. What I wanted to do, speaking of things that didn't work, is connect to the API, the Kubernetes API itself, and do stuff. So this is what I started with, which is why it took so long to get stuff to work. But apparently, if you're running PowerShell scripts and trying to get into contact with the Kubernetes API from the pod, you probably have to do something to allow it to do so. But basically, the idea here was just getting the address of the API server. On the pod, when you deploy a pod, you have a service account. That service account has certain rights through the API. By default, I should be able to just look at stuff. There's the path where the service account lays is the var run secrets Kubernetes IO/service account folder. The service account folder has a token, it has a namespace, and it has a certificate to be able to connect to the API. So this one runs and then just times out. But you can see here, kind of like the idea here is that we run a get on the API server URL. The API for Kubernetes is /API/v1/namespaces. This is basically when you look into, for instance, let's see, this job. You can see at top here, you have the batch v1 job. So this is basically the address written backward. Look at this again, and then, give off the token. I tried with skip word for certification check. That didn't help, and it just basically times out. But in theory, whenever I get the time to actually look into writes on the Kubernetes pod and so on and so forth, you should be able to connect directly to the Kubernetes API from within the pod and then do stuff. This is kind of where the Kubernetes operator idea came in, or was supposed to be. So a Kubernetes operator is a software agent that looks at a certain resource in the API. So again, for those who are not familiar with Kubernetes, Kubernetes basically has an API with different resources, but it also has something called a custom resource definition. So you can create your own resources. And this is how people make services. Like, for instance, me, who do a lot of GitOps. GitOps works on like these defined resources that you can that a piece of software looks at and then try to consolidate at all times. So an operator basically looks at a resource in the Kubernetes API and makes sure that that is the reality, and then it just loops. So this would make a great example on easy way to do an operator through PowerShell, because you could just easily do a loop forever that looks at a certain resource. If that resource is changed, then do stuff. Doesn't help if I can't connect to the API though. Really nothing. So I forgot to say at the start, but if there are any questions along the way, that's also fine. But I think basically we have everything that needs. Any questions so far? Or at the end? No questions. Here's a question. Health checks. All right, so the question was if I've considered health checks on the endpoint. So for the pod, I am fairly sure it has a lot of functions. So as we can see, it basically has everything you would need from a web server. So creating health checks at that point shouldn't be a big issue. If you're running things in Kubernetes, if you can get it to work, basically what you would do is you would have an open endpoint that just gives off a HTTP 200 if hit, so you can in Kubernetes make sure that the service is up and running and stuff like that. That's one alternative. There was a hand there. Any recommendation on monitoring logs? Yeah. So again, if the container is then running in Kubernetes, there's a lot of tools for that. There's several log tools. If you go into, if you look into the CNCF, there's the OpenTelemetry and there's observability tag that deals with all these types of things. You have Loki from Grafana. You have Fluently Log. There's a lot of logging services, and all those things with with Prometheus, for instance, for metrics. Those things put together, you can then install, for instance, like Grafana to make a dashboard out of it to show off stuff. But basically, everything that does logging works because. When you're running PowerShell, it's just standard out and standard error. So the pod would then surface that, and Kubernetes knows that this is how you get logs out of these containers. So any native solution for Kubernetes would work. And if you're using Azure Functions or something like that, the built-in tools would work just as fine. So what was the first part of the question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the question is that in the drawing was a reference to API manager. And what was the rest of the question? Sorry. Right. So would you want to use the API manager API or have them directly go against the cluster? Yeah, I would say if it's in the same cluster, it's pretty safe to just use it as is, and you would, if it runs in the local context, security-wise, it's so much better, because at that point you don't actually need to take handle all the securities between all these endpoints. If it runs in the cluster and you give it, for instance, in Kubernetes, you can do network policies, so you can restrict what pods is allowed to talk with what pods. You could do that to make sure that there's no crosstalk and stuff like that. And at that point, a pod should just be able to connect to whatever. If you have it outside a system, like an Azure function, and you have something in AKS, for instance, and you want them to be interconnected somehow, I would rather go the route of setting a private link and all those kind of things and make sure that everything's happening at the back end and not go in and out. That would just make it easier, because at that point, the API manager would basically just be, this is how you connect publicly to the API, and then everything else is handled by the platform itself. I would go that route. All right. Any other questions? No? Well, if not, I would say that if you are interested in getting hands-on, again, Ben is going to do an actual hands-on with Azure Functions and creating APIs. I see that I would have just enough time to show that off if I did, but I removed it, like I said. So if you want to learn how to do APIs in a serverless fashion, I would recommend sticking around there. Yeah, so you get a little bit of minute backs, and you can wake up, get some coffee and stuff like that. So, thank you.